And it has till noon.
But not really. I thought about it.
Next week, it looks like the AP exam for my class, for AP US history, will be on the same day as the vigilante parade. Hasn't been that way for a while, so that'll be fun. You can do. But that's one I remember when people like were in the band or on the floor, they get down with the parade, they could sprint to thing, or get down with the test and then sprint to the parade. The parade's time got too excited. I'll tell you more about that. Okay, where do we finish it? We got Roosevelt Program. We got Dominican Republic. And it's happened in Venezuela, but where was the horrible insurrection? Bloody guerrilla fighting. What? Yeah. The Filipino insurrection in the Philippines. Who was the leader of the Filipino insurrection? Emilio Aguinaldo. Yeah. And what about, who did Roosevelt send over to be the territorial governor, who at least helped some to negotiate some kind of end of the war, who'd be riding a water buffalo? Yeah, William Howard Taft. And let's see what else. That was a big deal. We got right to the Dominican Republic. Oh, who assassinated McKinley? I went by really quick. Czolgosz. What was his philosophy? Czolgosz was a what? And that kind of fueled nativism, a lot of nativism at that time. So let's get to, so we got this, right? Economic imperialism, big stick diplomacy. Is that where we would quit? So it already happened in Venezuela. It'd be in Venezuela why we would issue it, even though it's already happening with the Platt Amendment, and we'll see it in Panama too. But they went default. U.S. banks own over half the loans. Is that where we quit? That makes sense to everybody? And well, the banks went to Roosevelt, specifically Secretary of State John A., and said, we want our money. Now, let's be very clear about something. The banks made a business decision. This is a corporation, a bank, and they made a decision. They bought bonds from the Dominican Republic, which is basically meaning they loaned the Dominican Republic money with high interest rates. It was risky. They made a business decision that Dominican Republic will pay it back. They didn't. And so if you're in business, you make a bad business decision, you lose money, right? That's business. That's the market. That is supposed to be the essence of capitalism. But not here. They made a loan. The banks wanted their money. They made a bad business decision. Guess what? They didn't. The U.S. sent in the Marines. They occupied, not just occupied, they took over the government and control of all revenues of the Dominican Republic at gunpoint and said 55% of all revenues, meaning tax revenues, have got to go to the creditors. And you want to guess how long that would go on? So 1941. So what that meant is the hardworking, impoverished peasants of the Dominican Republic are going to be squeezed for tax revenues. And it's not going to be taxes that will build roads or hospitals or schools. It will go north to corporations. Not to the US, it would go to corporations and their stockholders. Hey, not a bad deal for banks, huh? They can make risky business decisions and still make money. Still make money. And this is going to start a trend. US banks will make more and more risky, dangerous loans. They'll go down to Latin America and encourage countries, help them issue the bonds, knowing that they'll never lose. Even if the country goes default, the Marines will come in and get their money. There's a term for this. If you create laws that will encourage this kind of behavior, which is not good business behavior, this is just pure making money. It's called the rentier economy. It's called moral hazard. If you encourage bad behavior, guess what you're going to get? Bad behavior. And that's what the banks are going to do. And you're going to get some of the most shady governments that are basically based upon thievery, based upon thievery, will make these loans and then just enrich themselves with the money, knowing that they don't have to pay it back. It's the people of their country. And squeeze their own countries and get rich. And we'll see this time after time. So here's the cartoon. It's implying that Roosevelt, with the now Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, is protecting poor little Dominican Republic from European claimants. That's not what happened at all. And this is going to trigger intervention after intervention. So big stick diplomacy will intervene all over for economic imperialism. And I really want to emphasize that. Big stick economic imperialism. Big stick economic imperialism. The number one reason, as we mentioned before, we've got to be very clear for this last part, banks, creditors. We just talked about it. And this goes on to this very day. Then corporations, other corporations, who want to go in and economically control. So they want to coerce countries to sign treaties to allow big trade advantages for corporations, or for that matter, literally take land. Most famously, bananas became the rage in the 1890s. So pineapples were the fruit of the wealthy. Bananas were every man's fruit, this exotic fruit that you could get and eat that was just maybe once or twice a year, now year round. And the company that controlled Latin American fruit was United Fruit. Bananas are great. I love bananas. But they'll last forever. I mean, as long as you keep the temperature stable, a banana will last for 3 or 4 months. Take them out of green. Okay, they're not as good if they ripen them off the tree, but they're not bad. And they last a long time. So you can have bananas for a very long time to be shipped all the way up. And United Fruit will make a big deal about the banana boat, bringing the bananas. And they really try to portray the exotic nature of the bananas. They would even hire musicians. There'd be a very popular song in the 1920s called the Banana Boat Song. And it's great advertising. But in reality, they control these countries. So here are Guatemalan peasants working for the banana company. And by the 1920s, for example, they controlled, either through their own ownership or deals with other big landholders, 90% of the Isthmus of Central America. They controlled the Arab world. Is that my phone? I'm getting a phone call. I must be really important. It's better be important. You have to go. You know that. So, anybody know what they would mark? Oh, you ever heard the saying Banana Republic? It was not because they had the bananas there. It was because the banana company ran the countries. They call it the octopus. And they ran the entire place. In fact, see what they branded? Working on science stuff? See ya. They branded it under Chiquita. So you see Chiquita, that's United Fruit. In fact, by the end of the 1960s, they became so powerful that they had banana-shaped satellites orbiting the Earth, beaming into your skull banana-related propaganda. Who's had a banana today? I have a banana every first period. I have a banana. Why? You can't help it. Look how effective that is. Okay, I like bananas, but they dominated the country. We will come back to United Fruit. What other mining interests, especially like bauxite, aluminum, nickel, cadmium, things for steel. Aluminum was just becoming big. But other exporting interests to take advantage of Latin American products. Now, here's the deal. does big stick diplomacy want a democracy in these countries, or do they want dictatorships? Democracies or dictatorships? They want dictatorships. Democracy, if the people have a voice, they might say, no, we don't want all the wealth of our bananas or aluminum to go north. We don't want our tax revenues to go up to Wall Street banks. Now you can understand what the banks are thinking, but you can imagine other people don't want that either. The United States will claim they are for democracy. In fact, one of the reasons they'll give her entering World War I will be to make the world safe for democracy. And yet the United States is going to support dictatorship after dictatorship after dictatorship all over Latin America. Why? Because the dictators have a better chance to do what they want. Now, dictators cannot do whatever they want. Dictators are overthrown all the time. But still, they make deals. So this will have a problem down the road. Where the United States will claim to be for democracy, yet supporting dictatorships. Most famously, in 1959, Richard Nixon, the Vice President of the United States, through Dwight Eisenhower, went on a goodwill tour of Latin America. And all over Latin America, but most famously in Caracas, Venezuela, that seems familiar today, but also Bogota and Colombia, we'll get to that. They were attacked by mobs. In fact, in Caracas, they just about broke into his limousine. They're trying to rip out the doors and attack Nixon. And Americans had no idea why. They just assumed they were communists. No, they were mad about all these interventions. That's what they were mad about. So, here are all the interventions that happened between 1900 and starting and ending or going on in 1920. And these are all over. So, I mean, you have Dominican Republic, US troops stayed till 24 and had financial control till 1941. Cuba, year after year. Nicaragua, so many times the US would take over. Panama, Puerto Rico, twice, attacking Mexico in 1914 and even invading with cavalry in 1916. Failed miserably. But the US is going to intervene all over. And they're not asking countries, hey, can we come in? The US is just doing it. It's all over. And the important thing about that is, excuse me, so countries like Guatemala and Salvador, they're not being attacked, but they're looking at Honduras, which was occupied for a year and a half by US Marines. And they're thinking, we better do what the United States wants, or they're coming for us. And so the thing about the intervention wasn't so much that they intervened, it also terrified everybody else to avoid intervention. And they're not going to forget this. It'll be all over. When Franklin Roosevelt became president in 1933, the United States tried very hard to have a much more cooperative relationship and end the interventions. But then when the Cold War began, it all started up again. So this is after the Cold War, and these are just military coups that the US would try to organize all over Latin America. This ends in 2010, this chart was made. So it doesn't have a couple attempts, most famously 3 weeks ago in Venezuela. And one that's right now the US is blockading Cuba. And so, and causing starvation in Cuba right at this moment. And so it kind of still goes on, and it begins here. And speaking of this, we talked about the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary. Well, Trump is proclaiming a Trump doctrine to the Monroe Doctrine. And do you know what he has called it? Here's the New York Post, which actually is pretty favorable to President Trump, but they also have pretty comically weird headlines. But he calls it the Monroe Doctrine. And so this is an example, yes, claiming Canada and Greenland, but also the Gulf of America. But this is kind of happening all over, including Venezuela. So the point is, we're getting similar things right now, right at this moment. So it's important to understand there is a trend line here. And President Trump's favorite president is McKinley. He claims tariffs, he loves tariffs. And so, let's get to Nicaragua. Nicaragua is going to be attacked and occupied through almost this entire era until a brutal dictatorship called the Somoza regime would take power for 40 years. What am I saying 40 years? 60 years. Here are Marines in Managua. And the big thing was to take over the finances to pay back the debt to American banks. Bad business decision? No bad decisions. They're going to get rich anyways. Those are U.S. Marines in Managua. Hey, what flag are they carrying? What flag is that? It's a pirate flag. Hey, these are smart men. They know it. First thing they do is go over and take over the entire gold reserve of Managua and send it north. They knew exactly what they were doing. They're being pirates. They're taking their money and sending it north. They're smart. They know. They're kind of making fun of it in a way. The most decorated soldier in American history up until World War II. In fact, he won the Congressional Medal of Honor twice. Once in occupation of Haiti, once in occupation of Managua. Retired as a general. His name was Smedley Butler. Yes, his name was Smedley. And he would look back at this and write one of the most famous books of that era called I Was a Gangster for Wall Street, where he talks about this. We will come back to Smedley Butler. So, the Panama Canal is another classic example of basic diplomacy. So, the French had already tried to build a canal there and it failed. They ran into swamps, mountains, and yellow fever. To talk about doing one through through Nicaragua, but it was just too wide and too mountainous. So they always came back to Panama. And a number of different spots, but the most narrow spot was decided, even though they had to go through a pretty high mountains, right here. So the canal's right here. Ironically, to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific, you go east. The canal. Just by the way the makes that little turn. Well, the Spanish-American War, though, proved a necessity. As you can see from that map there, look how many fewer miles, 5,200 to 1,300 miles to go around from coast to coast. And when the U.S. wanted to move ships from San Francisco up to Tampa for the war, it proved, or it seemed to show to the United States, this is not just a business, this is a security imperative. But here's the problem. Panama was part of Colombia. And you might notice one other thing. Even though Colombia's here, Panama's here, it's just connected by this narrow figure of land, which right here is still unpassable to this day. Today, this is an unpassable stretch of jungle and swamps. It is in mountains. There's no roads through it now, let alone then. And so, only way Colombia could get to Panama City is by sea. And so it's kind of separate. So Panama has this little bit separate identity. There's a rumbling to be independent, but not really that much. So let's get to the canal. The Roosevelt administration begins to offer Colombia money. And they said, we're going to give you a generous deal, $10 million and money down the road. And Colombia said, you got to double that. And turned down the offer. You got to double. Actually, the president of Colombia accepted, their legislature turned it down. Roosevelt was furious. But Colombia knew one very important thing. Whatever country has the canal will make so much money in fees and tolls, it will dwarf this amount. And so the United States literally wants to carve out a section of Panama, make it part of the United States, a territory, and then control the canal and get all the fees. It's highway robbery. Everyone knew it. Roosevelt was furious. And his administration began to intrigue with people in Panama, saying, hey, you want to be independent? Want to be independent? We'll help you out. And then in 1903, there was a revolution in Panama. Now, the revolution only involved a couple hundred people. They took over the government offices, the Colombian government office, part of Colombia, in Panama City, and declared independence. Colombia wanted to send troops up, but this might shock you. On either side, both sides of the isthmus, U.S. naval ships. U.S. Navy is not that big, yeah, but a lot bigger in Colombia. The U.S. Navy just happened to be there. And they stopped Colombia from sending anybody up therefore assuring Panama would be independent. Assuring it. So all of a sudden, Panama became independent with American aid. And guess what they did the next year? They would sign the Hay-Bonavarea Treaty, Bonavarea Treaty. He helped, he was with the French and then would help the Americans in the revolution and then become the new Panamanian foreign minister. 10,250,000 a year, and then it would be doubled and then doubled again. Because everybody knew how much money Panama was going to make. So this is the classic cartoon. Here's Roosevelt going to dig the canal, New Panama, and dumping the dirt on the capital of Bogota, the capital of Colombia. So the U.S. ended up paying more than what than Colombia wanted, but they're going to get their canals. Now, Roosevelt would try to claim that these were freedom fighters, and the U.S. had nothing to do with it. They were freedom fighters fighting for the independence of Panama. In fact, they were the moral equivalent of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. And would say this. And Secretary of State John Hay, one time in a cabinet meeting when Roosevelt would just start ranting, start talking about this. And Hay said, come on, let's not take this with any sense of legality. We know exactly what happened, and this is the famous statement. You don't have to write this down, but you don't have to. But if you stole it, fair and square. You stole it. The U.S. got it because the U.S. wanted it. Proof of this is the United States, it's connected by telegraph on it, wired down to Panama to congratulate the freedom fighters for their glorious fight for independence. But they had the day wrong and sent it 3 days. They were clairvoyant. They just knew the revolution was going to happen. Now, remember in Hawaii, the U.S. Navy helped the planters overthrow the Queen. But they did that on their own. They did it in Washington. And I showed you all those coups. This is going to happen time after time in Latin America through, well, Venezuela. Just literally happened. The U.S. did. So this is a long trend. But the first one we really see is right here. Well, they immediately had trouble. American workers couldn't handle the climate and the diseases. Going through the mountains was a much more daunting task than they thought. Eventually, William Goethals, I'll show you a picture of him in just a second, of the Army Corps of Engineers, would organize the construction. And even though it would take till 1914, this would be one of the greatest technological feats in world history. Because they had to make 4 massive locks to get through the mountains. And then they basically dammed a river and flooded the top of the kind of this big plateau to allow the boats to go through. They had to dredge it. And has anyone been through it? Every once in a while I get students who have gone through it. They've like, either went to Panama, went on a cruise. I haven't. I think it'd be really cool to go to the Panama Canal. But what if yellow fever and malaria? They did import a number of workers from the West Indies. Panama's a really cosmopolitan town, a cosmopolitan country, but a lot of workers from Jamaica would come over to Panama. So Panama's a really interesting place. But Dr. Walter Reed, who was in Cuba, and Gorgas, who was in Panama, began to work on the problem of yellow fever and malaria. And they thought it was like swamp gas, maybe drinking bad water, but what turned out to be spreading yellow fever and malaria? And they're the ones who discovered it was mosquitoes. Today, the U.S. Army Hospital is called Walter Reed Hospital. It's mosquitoes. How do you get rid of mosquitoes? Mosquitoes breed in stagnant water. So like in Havana, what Dr. Reed would have people do is go through and any cistern, any water that was stagnant, they'd immediately dump it out. To make sure there's no stagnant water to cut down on larvae. But what about like in Panama, where there's swampland all over where they're building this canal? How do you get rid of it there? Well, let me cut through, I got in the wrong order. Oh, that's Goethals of the Army Corps of Engineers. See what he's doing? They had thousands of men, mostly Panamanians, but some others from the West Indies. And they would go through the Caribbean islands, go through with these spray, they'd have these jerry cans and they would spray oil on top of every swamp and every water. Cover with oil, the oil would spread out and therefore block all oxygen going in and kill everything in the swamp, including the mosquitoes. So give them a little break. I know, it's horrible, but that's how they did it. So that's how they figured it out. In 1914, the canal would be finished, ironically, the same year of World War I. 1904, Roosevelt did go down there. And he very carefully did not leave the borders of the United States. No American president ever, sitting president, ever left the borders of the United States until Woodrow Wilson at the end of World War I. The canal zone was in U.S. territory, so it was always in U.S. territory. Here he is on one of the massive steam shovels they had there. And here are the three massive blocks. Gatun Lake is, they dammed the river. Went through here. The problem is now, because of climate change, they're having less rain there. So there are real problems. I should add, they have widened the canal, rebuilt part of it, so we take bigger ships. Because it was so hard to build, it was narrow, and as ships got bigger, US ships had to be constructed to fit through the canal. So that is a USS Iowa, a battleship that was completed during World War II. It's finished right near the end of World War II. It's a massive, it's a 63,000 tons battleship. Look how tight it is to get through the canal. After World War II, battleships became obsolete, but aircraft carriers, they just said the heck with it. And now the carriers can't go through it. The big super containers, super tankers can't go through it. Iowa. Oh, one more thing. In the 1970s and 1978, President Carter would sign a treaty and would eventually be ratified that would give Panama back to Panama, the Panama Canal back to Panama. So the canal is now owned by Panama because it's in their country. And the US made a lot of money off of fees. And that's part, I guess, of the Don Rowe document, that he's thinking the US should take the canal. The US should have, not Panama, even though it's in their country. So after Roosevelt left office, William Howard Taft would become president, and he called his policy Taft dollar diplomacy. And it was to try to be more stable and to avoid the confrontation of big stick diplomacy. Yet he actually used the Marines just as much, arguably more, than Roosevelt did. But the big thing is he encouraged control and business growth through debt. He would encourage, the US government would encourage foreign countries to borrow money. And then if they couldn't pay back their debt or have trouble making payments, they say, we'll help you with the payments, but you must do this, 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 and this. And that's still policy for a very long time. Here is Taft's dollar diplomacy and two American companies go invest in Latin America. The full faith of the US government and its military. Woodrow Wilson would claim he's changing it, but basically do the same thing. Let's leave that and go to Asia. Because Asia, remember the US went to war and took the Philippines, as it shows here, as an opening to trade with China. And here's showing that Uncle Sam carrying all the US trade goods to China. And after all, the Philippines are only a stepping stone to China. That's what the cartoon says. China, at that time, the largest population-wise country in the world. What a market. And as you can see from this map, European powers and Japan were beginning to carve up Asia. All the great powers were looking at ways to cut up China, carve it up. China was so powerful in 1750 and had become weak, ravaged by civil war and poverty by 1890, and every powers were licking their lips. Look at the British Empire, India, what is now Pakistan, Bangladesh, Burma. Thailand barely survived, then it was called Siam. Dutch colonies, French Indochina. By the way, French Indochina, the big area is a place called Vietnam. US is here, Russia, Japan, all surrounding China, much like what's happening in Africa. China, therefore, the US wanted trade. The United States did not want to mess with colonies in China. They didn't want to do that before the Filipino insurrection, but especially after. And that image of a fence, the wall around the United States, I've shown you before. Here is keep Chinese out, to keep Chinese out. And look at the horrible caricature using those stereotypes to breed, well, nativism and prejudice. But two things. First off, the Opium Wars, I've mentioned this once before, but there were two Opium Wars that the British would defeat the Chinese, showing the British superior technology. China got complacent because they're so powerful. And they forced a bunch of unequal treaties to open up Chinese trade, economic imperialism. And then don't forget, the United States did, we've already mentioned this once before, the Chinese Exclusion Act, even though the technical name of the law was Oriental. I just remember people calling East Asia Oriental. East Asia, they're showing the East to the point of view of the Europeans. Long story why it's called Oriental, but so China knows all about this. To this day, they really know the Opium Wars. Well, you're going to get by the 1880s and 1890s, a lot of the great powers taking advantage of these unequal treaties, putting trade fortifications, troops to control the trade, just pecking away at Chinese independence. And that's going to lead to one of the most important